Good morning, everybody. It is 10:20, so I'll get going. Welcome to NDC Copenhagen. I hope you have a fantastic time here. Richard Campbell opening us up with a keynote. He's amazing, as always. So he's told you about the sort of past and future, well, potential futures of AI. I am here to tell you about the past and potential futures of data storage, something which we all touch in some degree in our work as people who work with computers, whatever your particular role may be. And so this is a tour through history of how we've turned knowledge into physical objects so that we can keep more of it. The obligatory, is it working? Come on, click a test. There we go. Obligatory about me slide. I do a lot of stuff. I'm mostly just a nerd about people and language and computers. I currently work at a research institute, which is fascinating, but has its own set of perverse incentives that you don't necessarily find in venture-funded tech. And I wrote this talk when I was working at a cloud service provider, because what cloud service providers do essentially is it's hardware on demand, right? It's hardware as a service, and a lot of that hardware is permanent data storage or long-term data storage. And I'll talk about the specific bits of the specific cool thing that made me write this talk when we get to it later. But I started learning when I was working at this company about how and why we store data the way that we do. And I went down like a lot of rabbit holes. So to get started, I should define some terms. What do I mean when I talk about data storage? I like to use an analogy, and I love Sherlock Holmes, so the analogy I'm going to use is from one of the Sherlock Holmes stories. It turns out that the titular detective doesn't in fact know that the Earth revolves around the sun. A thing that was a well-known fact by the time of these stories, when these stories were set. And he defends this sort of gap in his knowledge, basic knowledge about the universe we live in, by saying that his brain is like an attic crammed full of furniture that represents memories, facts, information. And that in order to store that knowledge about the solar system, which doesn't benefit him in any of his day-to-day work as somebody who hunts down criminals and solves mysteries, it wouldn't benefit him in any way to have that knowledge about the Earth revolving around the sun. And if he did keep that knowledge, he'd need to get rid of something else. And obviously this is a very simplistic way of thinking about it, but it is true that we only really have capability to remember so many things. And we want to be able to know and reason about and work with, as technologists, many more things. And when I say technologists, I mean since the inception of humans using tools. That's sort of the scope of what I mean when I talk about technology. So how many people in this room know 3 phone numbers by heart? 4? 5? How many people have had to call 5 or more different phone numbers in the last 6 months? Okay, few. As we get more and more into just like, you can do everything over email or chatbot or whatever. But my point here is that we need to know and use lots more information than we have the capacity to remember long term. And so in order to solve this problem, what we do is we try and turn information, understanding, knowledge into physical objects so that we can keep them in our physical ownership as well as our mental ownership, or instead of our mental ownership. This talk is about how we as a species have done and continue to do that, and the impact that computers have had on these solutions. In terms of computers, what I'm going to be talking about specifically is non-volatile memory, so memory that does not lose its state when it loses power. Modern RAM does do that, modern hard disks do not, for example. Oh, no, that's the wrong slide. Another thing I'm going to touch on is the durability of data storage, because as soon as you turn information into a physical object, that has physical properties, like is it fireproof? Is it proof against magnetics, like magnetic interference? The durability of the physical medium impacts your ability to maintain this knowledge that's encoded within it. But then when it comes to encodings, there's also a point about the durability of encodings. If you can write something down on an indestructible object, but then you can't read it later, it's not very useful, is it? For example, who can tell me where this QR code, without getting out your phone, who can tell me where this QR code leads? Some of the people in the room might be able to make a guess, but without specialized technology, in order to decode this encoded knowledge, it doesn't matter if I can copy this image endlessly, propagate it infinitely across the internet, and send it to whoever I like. It's physically very durable in the sense that I can replicate it easily with the technology of my phone, but I also require the technology of my phone to read it. If phones went away tomorrow, this knowledge would be lost. So What is on the agenda today? I'm going to talk about old things, like really old things. How did we write things down before we had electricity? Then we get into, yes, electricity, so this is very early computing stuff, the things that are the precursors to, direct precursors to the tools we use today. I'm going to talk about the tools we use today. And lastly, for a bit of fun, I'm going to look at where we might go next, and sort of emerging technologies in the data storage space. So, old stuff, no electricity. This is some stuff that has survived the test of time. And when I mean old, I mean Bronze Age. This is a clay tablet. And they were used as sort of scratch pads. You would write your cuneiform, this is cuneiform, and then they would be left to air dry rather than fired in a kiln. And as a result, they're not very durable physically. The ones we have today, like the one up here, was accidentally fired, therefore making it into like pottery, sort of, and much more durable, because a guy's house caught fire. As a result, we actually know about the guy's house, the guy whose house caught fire. He was a copper merchant called Nazir, and all the tablets in his house, or many of the tablets in his house, were lists of customer complaints about the quality of the copper he sold. This is from ancient Mesopotamia in about 1750 BCE, so we're looking at nearly 4,000 years ago. This tablet is considered to be the oldest known written complaint, and one of a few that were found in the ruins of this guy's house. The writing on this is Akkadian cuneiform, and that writing system was actually lost for a long, long time. We did not know what this tablet said. Linguists in the 18th and 19th century had to spend a lot of time figuring out how to decode this writing, decipher it. So the physical object accidentally became very physically durable, but the encoding on it was lost for a long time and had to be rediscovered. Another point about, sort of on a tangent about what we can learn from this. Lots of people have taken this proliferation of customer complaints about Nazir to mean that he was a shady copper merchant and that he sold poor quality copper. But it's equally possible that he kept a record of all the customers who had spuriously complained about him, so that he may never do business with those people again because he knew them to be, dealing in bad faith. We can't necessarily make assumptions about what this information meant, we just have it. And that's something that I think is also very interesting to think about in terms of when we think about what information means and how to use it. It's one thing to have the information, it's another to have the context to know what that information meant. Next thing, pen and paper. I use this a lot today. It's not gone anywhere. Clay tablets, not around so much. Pen and paper, still thriving. Ink and parchment, pigments on papyrus. Again, the encoding here, like with the cuneiform, it's written language. So we have to be able to understand that language in order to be able to get the information back out of the physical object. This photo is of the first 2 pages of the Beowulf manuscript, which was produced sometime between 975 and 1025 CE, so 1,000 years ago. We don't know when the poem itself was written. This is the only copy we have in the world. Who's heard of Beowulf, the poem? Yeah, we only have one copy of it, one extant copy. And the manuscript that the Beowulf poem is written on formed part of a library called the Cotton Library, after a guy named Cotton, who had a fondness for old, weird stuff. For a time, the Cotton Library was stored in this building called Ashburnham House. Does anyone want to guess what happened to Ashburnham House? Fire, not so good for manuscripts. Great for clay tablets longevity, but not manuscripts so much. It's nominative determinism at its best. Ashburnham House caught fire. A lot of the library was either damaged or lost, and the Beowulf manuscript suffered a bit of scorching at the time and continued to accrue damage over time afterwards as a result. We almost lost this incredibly important, in the study of Old English, poem, a poem that inspired Tolkien. If you like Lord of the Rings, you owe that to the existence of this poem and us being able to read it. But the physical object on which it was written is incredibly fragile, needs conservation. Now, this is all very interesting, but you may be thinking this is supposed to be a tech talk. We're here at a tech conference. What does this have to do with technology? I get to share one of my favorite facts with you now. The English word for technology comes from ancient Greek techne, meaning art, technical, right? From Proto-Indo-European, and then that also gives the same Latin for textiles. So textiles, I'm a knitter and crocheter personally, are technology. And this is actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it, because as humans, we've got some, like, as animals, we've got some needs. We've got, food, shelter, lots of things like this. But as part of shelter, what that means is clothing to keep us warm. As we become more technologically advanced, sails for ships. Producing textiles was one of the key technological sites of innovation for humans because it was one of the things we needed, that and agriculture. So textile production has been a huge, huge part of human history for as long as we've been humans, pretty much. If you like to look at illuminated manuscripts, you'll often see women with drop spindles. This is a drop spindle here. And that's because if you were a woman and you were in the 12th, 13th century or whatever, and you had 5 spare minutes, no, you didn't. You had 5 minutes to spin some yarn for use in clothing. This is where we get the English idiom spinning some yarn to mean telling a story, because women would sit together and spin yarn and tell each other stories. And if you like etymology, you should go to Molly's talk tomorrow about the history of computing languages, or history of the language we use in computing and technology. But textiles, where textiles start to converge towards what we understand as technology today as computer programmers, is with the invention of the loom in 2nd century China. People invented the draw loom, fabric for weaving thread, a machine for weaving thread into fabric, which helped streamline fabric production enormously. Now, something you might notice about the fabric in this photo, it's very pretty. It's got a lot of nice colors in it. We'll make do as people with boring, plain fabric, but we like fancy things. We like pretty things. We like things with patterns on them. And it's possible to do that on this kind of loom, but it's incredibly labor intensive. And it requires you to continuously select the correct thread out of a bunch of them in a repetitive, perhaps encodable way. But actually doing that was incredibly error-prone and, in terms of the bigger looms that we came to use in Europe, quite dangerous. You would have a thing called there was a job called being a draw boy for young children, whose job it was to go and draw the right threads through to make very fancy fabric. And the mortality rate was quite shocking. So obviously this is an opportunity for technological innovation. And what happened was punch cards. Because if you've got a bunch of sort of information that needs to be acted upon mechanically, repetitively, this is what punch cards do. And the way that a punch card works on a loom is that you have, when you're weaving fabric, you've got some threads that go up and down. That is the warp threads. And then the threads that weave back and forth, weft threads. Weft and weaving are the same word in sort of English root. And so the way that it works is you've got your warp threads, and those open up, and then like half go to the top, half go to the bottom. And if you're doing fancy patterns, the ones that go to the top and the ones that go to the bottom will be chosen differently each time depending on their colors, right? And then the weft threads go through, and then you swap them, and then they go through again, right? So that's the physical mechanism. And the way that a punch card works is it tells you which warp threads to select. If there's a hole in the punch card, a little hook can come through and pick up the thread. And if there's no hole, the hook can't make it. And so that thread is not selected as the top part of the warp, let's say. So they're ones and zeros. Are you selecting this thread or not selecting this thread? If you actually look at punch cards, they will resemble physically the pattern of the fabric that they create. And they are still in use today. Here's some fabric woven with one of these punch card operated looms. The ideas behind this were developed by a few different artisans and the inventors in France in the 1700s. So that's when punch cards got started. That's sort of the beginning of programmable machines. They were programmable with these punch card inputs. And it was a guy called Joseph-Marie Jacquard who really popularized these. He patented a machine that you could bolt on to an existing loom called a Jacquard head. We call such augmented looms Jacquard looms. And this is incredible data durability. Like some patterns from punch cards made in the 1700s are still in use today. Not the original punch cards, presumably, but the data has remained. And particularly having access to the physical machines that interpreted and acted on that data means that we don't lose the ability to understand the encodings, right? I haven't lost my phone to be able to go decode the QR code. That's the sort of same principle here. Right. Film photography. Is anyone here a film photography nerd? Anyone do colloidal or something? Or yeah, we got a wiggle. This is the earliest image derived from a photographic process, or rather the left is the original photographic image, or plate, and the right is a colorized version of the resulting image. If you are a film photography nerd, you may well recognize this. It was created by a guy called Nicéphore Niepce in 1826. And it used a camera obscura, which is like you have a little pinpoint of light, a little pinpoint through which light comes, and the different angles of the light sort of traverse on the other side to give you an upside down image of whatever it was looking at. If you sort of imagine like there's a little pinpoint here and light comes in and light comes in, like the only light that makes it to the other side is the light that was in the cone that was at a point, and then it creates the opposite cone. And then, anyway, it's very cool. Look up camera obscuras. And the way that this photographic process, the way that this light was turned into a physical object representing the play of light on that thing is with a surface that reacts to sunlight, giving a different texture. So the actual original photographic plate, sort of intensity of light, as determined by the chemical makeup of the plate, is then represented by texture. And we see texture representing data in, well, data storage formats that we use today, in fact. Film photography is really interesting as far as data storage goes, because the encoding itself has no like human bias in it. It's like this plate was a purely chemical process. Obviously, there's human parts in determining what to photograph, for example, but the way that a JPEG is stored has had a human component in the designing of that encoding process in a way that, like, the play of light on this chemical substrate doesn't. And that's an interesting philosophical debate point, or not debate point, but like sort of thing. But like, you know, actual film photographs are phenomenally faithful and unbiased records of information. This is a daguerreotype. It's publicly available kind of photography. And it's possibly the very first candid photo ever, which is the reason it's in this talk. Because you had to stay still for a long time in order to show up in these things, get a very long exposure time. This, that you can see in the pink circle there, is a guy having his shoe shined by somebody, and they would have been stood there in a very similar position for the entire duration of the exposure of this camera, this particular photo, and everyone else was moving too fast and didn't get captured. And so this is possibly the first candid photo ever, which is really, really cool. Coming back to the idea of texture and data, is anyone here a vinyl nerd? Yeah, more vinyl nerds than film photograph nerds, but only by a handful. The reason that these are, I want to call these out specifically, is they are the first example of a paradigm that we see throughout storage of data, which is that it's a spinning disk with data recorded on it in a spiral or in concentric rings, and then you have a head, the needle, that you can position on the disk to read data off it as the disk spins. This is a paradigm we see again and again. It's very efficient. Vinyl disks have a single spiral track, it's running outwards from the center, and then data is encoded as variations in texture on the surface of the disk, and the head is just a little needle that runs over that track, and then in modern vinyl players will interpret that electronically and give you sound outwards. So this is a close-up of vinyl, and the data here is encoded in the texture of the disk, which, if any of you have ever handled vinyl, know. The disk itself does not have a protective casing with it. So when you touch it with your greasy hands, greasy human fingers, it will affect the data on that disk, or it will affect how that data is interpreted, because you're changing the texture, and that's what the data is represented by. You know, we get the phrase like a broken record, meaning repetitive, because a scratch on the surface of the disk can cause the head to jump back and replay the same section. Like it will actually jump back a track, and you'll get another rotation of the disk again and again and again. So physically, they're pretty fragile. And the encoding itself can be compromised by fairly common things like dust or grease from fingerprints or scratches. So they're not great as a data storage solution, but people love them, so they stick around. Right, now we are entering the wonderful world of electricity, magnetism, and computers. So punch cards round 2. This is so a guy called Herman Hollerith developed machines for tabulating census data in the US in the 1890 census. And all that data was stored on punch cards. He later founded a company which got merged with a few others, eventually becoming the corporation we know today as IBM. And the concept here is the same as with the loom. A hole in the punch card allows a connection to be made. In this case, it is an electrical connection. A spring would drop down through the hole in the punch card and connect to a pool of mercury, which was very safe, I'm sure. And this would complete a circuit, allowing an electrical connection to be made. Something you might notice about this punch card is it has 80 columns. And if you are an old terminal head, you will know that 80 columns is the standard width of a lot of terminals. This is why. It's because computers grew out of these punch cards and we kept artifacts like 80 character columns. This is why you will have 79 character line limits on your code so that you can have the 79 characters with a little plus or a minus for git diffs to fit in the 80 character terminal window. And yeah, this was, a lot of people say, you know, this is the birth of computing. I would go and argue that the punch cards for the looms were that. And it's all about this trajectory through mechanizing common tasks, mechanizing them in programmable ways, and then that giving rise to modern computing through the addition of electricity. Punch cards were used for data input, output, and tabulation, because, you know, you can multiple holes in the same, you know, the Swiss cheese thing, where if you've got multiple holes that all line up in a stack of punch cards, perhaps that can tell you something about the data that's stored on them. But they were superseded by magnetic storage of various kinds, which is what we're taking a look at now. Drum memory. More spinning things. Now we're cooking with magnets. Magnetic storage works like this. You have some surface of ferromagnetic material, iron, cobalt, nickel, certain rare earth metals, and you arrange them in a certain crystalline structure, and then you can manipulate the magnetic polarity of that material to store data as binary, positive or negative corresponding to 0 or 1. And drum memory works by having your cylinder coated in that magnetic material and a head that can read, one or more heads that can read or write to that material and change the magnetic polarity of that surface. Data is stored in tracks, which are circles around the outside of the drum. Here's another photo of some drum storage. This one is from a Polish computer called the ZAM41. This one has multiple heads for reading and writing, because the trade-off of having one head is it's cheaper, right? But then that head has to do all of the work. It's got to be zipping in between tracks as the drum spins, you know, and that takes time, and that time is called seek time. You want to decrease your seek time because that means faster memory access. So more heads to read and write, or possibly only to write, depending on your needs, will mean faster memory access. That's really important when what you're using this for is your computer's working memory, and that's what these were often used for. So we start to see physical impacts on the hardware in order to address specific needs of the memory. If you were using this for secondary memory, you wouldn't use one with loads and loads of read heads, read and write heads. You would put up with perhaps slower access time in order to save money when you only needed to access something irregularly. That's a pattern we'll see again and again. Right, magnetic cores. We're going back to this now because RAM is expensive, right? That's what we're doing. This was the dominant form of random access memory storage for decades, and it was so ubiquitous that it was just core memory, or just core. You've got these rings of magnetic material, and they represent bits, and their state, their magnetic state, is manipulated by wires which run through them, which you can pass current through. And I think it might have been, you know, physics when I was 18, you learn about if you've got magnetic current passing through a thing, or electric current, that it's an electromagnetic force, right? You can manipulate magnetic state with electricity. When a current is run through these wires, they'll magnetize the core in one direction or another, and it stores state. Reading from the core also destroys its state, resets its value to 0. So reading is a destructive action with this kind of memory. One neat fact about this kind of memory is that it was heated, not cooled, in order to improve performance. The constraint with the efficiency of using electricity to manipulate magnetic properties is that the temperature needs to be consistent. Doesn't necessarily need to be low, it needs to be consistent. And it's easier to heat something like this up than it is to cool it down. So what you can do is you can have your modern computer with whatever RAM you've actually got, right? And you use that to heat up the core memory that you're now using because RAM is so expensive. And then you run like your own LLM instead of having to pay Anthropic lots of money. This memory, part of why it's sort of made it remains in consciousness is the phrase core dump. And you get this because if your computer crashed, the magnetic state of these cores would not be lost. If it loses its power mid, computation, you could still read the state that the machine was in as it died. That's a core dump. And we sort of see that terminology still used today for certain kinds of tracebacks and failure modes, right? Or information about failure modes. This was also called little old lady memory, or LOL memory, because the process of making it was by hand a lot of the time. And the people who were very skilled at working with small things, because these got, as we got demand for denser and denser physical memory storage, these cores became smaller and smaller, these rings. And the process of making it was very much like textile, like very, very fine sewing. So you would get little old ladies to manufacture this for you. Little old lady memory, lol memory. So, textiles, technology. Manufacturing this became eventually too labor-intensive, really, to scale any further, and eventually this was superseded by RAM for working memory, which I will not be covering because it is volatile memory. Now, this is core rope memory. But more specifically, this is actually not just memory. This is a piece of software. So this is a form of read-only memory, ROM, where the process of writing to it is done during its construction topologically. The order in which you are threading cables, magnetic cables, through these electric cables through these magnetic cores encodes the ones and zeros. So if you've got something like this, if it's sort of physically durable enough, you can chuck it around, and it's to do with the way that the wires interact with the cores in physical 3D space. That's what encodes the data into it. So to update the software, you've got to do lots of all complicated threading and unthreading. This was also, I think, sometimes called little old lady memory for that reason. The most famous usage of this was on the Apollo missions. You want your software not to be vulnerable to bit flips, right? You want this is incredibly physically durable when it comes to encoding data in a way that is readable by machine, but physically going to stand up to the pressures of launching into space. So a perfect usage for that. Very, very cool. And I feel old putting these in the old stuff section. Who has never used a floppy disk in this room? Yeah, every year that number's going to start going up. I did homework on these. These are, probably still got some somewhere. Seen here in 8-inch, 5.25 quarter-inch, and 3.5-inch sizes. These were the latest, greatest in removable storage from about the mid-1970s to the early 2000s. And they're called floppy disks. Has anyone ever taken the floppy disk out of its house? Yeah, you know why they're called floppy disks. The actual media that they use in order to encode data is magnetic film, magnetic tape, sort of. And they use the spinning disk method, which we're going to see again and again and again. So this is the inside of a floppy disk. This is a floppy disk and not just its protective casing. If you pick that up and shake it, it goes whoop, whoop, whoop. And closer up, it looks like this. This is an image that was taken with a magnetic field camera. And this is a close-up visualization of the data encoded on the floppy disk. The bright and dark parts represent different magnetic polarization. And that means that this particular form of memory, this is the first time we've seen magnetic sort of tape, magnetic film memory, but like with drums, if you put a magnet on it, it'll change your data. Probably not in ways that you intend or want or that are useful for you at all. So yeah, don't do this. That's from, Reddit hardware gore subreddit. And something about spinning disks and using spinning disks for data storage is that disks do not spin. If they spin at a constant angular momentum, the same amount of rotations per second, then different bits of the disk move at different speeds, right? A point on the outside of the disk is moving much faster than a point on the inside. And you can think about this as you go towards the center's really, it's spinning, but it's not moving, right? And this means that if you want to read every 100th of a second, let's say, you're going to need to read, but at much closer distances, the closer to the center of the disk you get, right? This is how you have to store data. Because around the outside of the ring, you only store the same data in the same sort of angular bit of the disk. Everyone with me? This means that you're not making very good efficient use of the amount of material you have on the outer layer. Those pink blobs are way too far apart. You could be storing data in those little gaps. And for a while, and Apple experimented with this in early Macintosh computers, they had a system where you had variable angular velocity, so that as you were reading from places in the outer edges of the disk, your disk would spin more slowly to allow you to read more closely packed data. And this worked. This upped the amount of data that you could store on a single amount of magnetic tape. A 3.5-inch floppy disk could store more data using this mechanism, but it's complicated and expensive, and it meant you needed different drivers and different floppy disk readers in order to be able to make use of it. incompatible usage of the same hardware because of different softwares built on top of it. So you could not read a disk written in that manner with a floppy disk driver and reader that was designed to read from something with constant angular velocity. So eventually, Apple Macintosh reverted back to constant angular velocity formats because it was what was dominating the industry, because it's simple. Now, before computing environments were regularly networked, these were the go-to method for transferring data around different computers. And of course, this legacy lives on with the save icon. When I was writing this talk for the first time, I got stickers made with the floppy disk, and the number of people who came up to me and were like, "Oh, why do you have stickers of the save icon?" Granted, a good chunk of them were 50-year-old conference speakers doing a bit, but there are people who do not know what the save icon represents, who are using computers and are in employment and so on, and it's just, passage of time marches on. Wikipedia calls them obsolescent as a technology, which is a great word. But they're not dead yet, or at least, this is from 2019, sorry. If, finally, the US nuclear weapons program no longer is running off floppy disks. I believe they were on 5.25 floppy disks rather than 3.5, which is even more niche. But if you ever worry that the technology you know best and that you love is getting old and you maybe need to reskill in something else, stuff's out there in production. You'll find work. It's fine. I'm sure there are still people making money off knowing stuff about floppy disks. I'm not getting paid for this, but I'm sure somebody is getting paid for knowing about floppy disks. It's still only mostly dead. It's not actually dead yet. I went on Amazon, had a look at some of the external floppy disk drives you can get. I couldn't find one with a USB-C connector. They're all USB-A. So maybe floppy disk external drive readers are also obsolescent, because who uses a USB-A anymore? I don't know. And that brings us on to current stuff. And what I'm going to show you now is a lot of spinning disks. Optical data storage. We have more spinning disks. Who has a desktop PC with an optical drive in it? Couple. Who has a games console that takes disks? More, much more. That's the reason that I've kept this in current stuff and not sort of obsolescent, because they are absolutely still out there and kicking, and this technology is still sort of used. And there is some stuff that might come in the future on this paradigm as well. I'm grouping a bunch of things together here under optical disks, things like Laserdisc, DVDs, writable CDs, CD-ROMs, Blu-ray. They all work in the same way. They all use the same paradigm as vinyl and floppy disks. Thing spins, thing reads. This is what a cross-section of one looks like. Apologies for the really crusty JPEG. But data is encoded with texture, bumps and dips on a polycarbonate layer. And disks representing the same data can then be mass-produced physically by stamping physically lots and lots and lots of disks. That layer with the texture is then coated in some kind of reflective metal, usually aluminium, and then a layer of lacquer to protect the disk. Although obviously, anyone who's used them knows, you can very easily scratch them. This is the detector, a lens from an Acer laptop optical disk drive, I believe specifically CD. The instrument reading the data is a laser, and it's pointing at that disk as that disk spins, and the reflectivity of that laser, how well that light is reflected back, which is controlled by the bumps and dips of the texture of the CD, that represents the data. So you spin a laser and you see what the disk gives you back, essentially. In CD-ROMs, which is read-only memory, like the core wrote memory, these were developed by Sony in 1984, and it wasn't until 1997 that we got ones that we could write at home, rewritable ones. They've got a rewritable CD, and something you might notice that is that it's got a much darker sheen to it. So if I go forward to the next slide, that's a nice bright color. This one's dark, moody, right? And that's because the thin coating of metal that's on top of that textured layer isn't aluminium, but in rewritable CDs, it is a silver indium antimony tellurium alloy. Try saying that 3 times fast with a mouthful of peas. And what it does is it allows the laser to create texture, because this thing will change its structure from shiny crystalline to dull, all jumbled up, if it's heated up enough, or if it's hit with the laser in the right way. This means that your laser can change the reflectivity of the disk itself. And the reflectivity is what encodes the data. In mass-produced CD-ROMs, that reflectivity is achieved by changing the texture of the underlying layer. In here, it's done by changing the structure of the metal layer. And to return the metal coating, once it's been hit by a laser and turned from shiny to sort of dull, like a tiny little spot, changed from shiny to dull, you can't use a laser to revert it. What you have to do is heat up the whole disk at once, which is what burning a CD is, or at least that's where that phrase comes from. So you can turn a 0 to a 1 with a laser, but you can't turn it back into a 0 without heating up the whole disk, which affects all of the data storage on it. So you can only write once to any one spot on this thing. And when we think about the physical durability of these things, as anyone who's used these knows, they're also quite prone to getting scratches and smudges. Most, if not all of us in this room, will have had this problem before. You can also shatter these. There's a really good video of the slow-mo guys spinning a CD until it shatters and capturing it with a high-speed camera. Really, really cool. And then, of course, there's encodings. If I have a disk and I have a disk drive, but my computer doesn't understand what these 1s and 0s mean, that's useless to me. It's just useless garbage binary, right? And that's true with pretty much all of the current stuff that we have that we're going to look at in the rest of this talk. If you lose the ability to interpret the data, it doesn't matter if you can get the data, right? Next thing up, magnetic tapes. Who is surprised to see this here in the modern stuff? Yeah? Yeah. Modern tapes are alive and well. And not just by, people who are like vinyl people who are using it as its own hobby. Magnetic tapes are used in commercial data storage. So unlike hard drives and flash memory, with this is a magnetizable tape that is wound around, right? That's the physical structure of this thing. With other forms of data storage that we've looked at before, random access is pretty easy. It's got a sort of fairly low fixed upper bound. If you've got a book, you can flip through it. If you've got a drum memory, you can move the head, and maybe the seek time is a little long. But with something like this, if I want to rewind my video all the way back to the beginning, that's a long time. It's got a linear access time depending on where your current read head is, right? And the read head being the this does not do laser. Nope. The read head being the bit that actually interfaces with the machine that's reading it. The hardware that reads and writes to these is known as a tape drive. And the first magnetic tapes were used to record computer data in 1951 for the UNIVAC 1. IBM quickly followed suit, set standards. Magnetic tapes have been in constant use ever since, despite their drawback of having very long random access times, or potentially a very high ceiling for random access times. And this is because they're very durable, magnetism-wise. They are, you're able to put them in housing that is pretty well protected from sort of random magnetic influences. They're cheap to manufacture, and they're removable from their surrounding hardware, which means that the data on them isn't vulnerable to computational attack, in the sense that it's not always live. Like a floppy disk, removable. If you've got data in a data center somewhere, stored on a tape that's just sitting in a room somewhere, you might need to wait a while before somebody else who works in that data center can come and put that tape into a tape drive for you. But this is an acceptable trade-off. Like with the using a drum with only one write head or read and write head for your secondary memory, it's acceptable to have certain trade-offs, like you might need to wait 24 hours for somebody to go to the data center and load your tape into a machine that can read off of it for your cold storage. Things like, I'm trying to remember what we called it at the Scaleway, the company I used to work at, but they were deep storage, cold storage of data. You've got to keep these records for 7 years for compliance reasons, but you don't expect to ever really have to look at them. Magnetic tapes are perfect for this. And this is what cloud companies do when they do hardware as a service. They may well have magnetic tapes servicing their long-term storage that they store on behalf of their customers. And it might take you might have to request certain data 24 hours in advance because somebody has to physically go, put the tape in, have a machine read it, and turn it into something that lives in an S3 bucket, right? But magnetic tapes, absolutely still around. One last note on these, though. Most famous example of the digital dark age, which is a concept I haven't mentioned by name here, but I've been alluding to when I talk about the ability to decipher data even if you have it. In 1976, NASA put a Viking lander on Mars. You can see Carl Sagan here next to a replica, and it recorded a bunch of data onto magnetic tapes. And NASA got the tapes back. Brilliant. They left them in a cupboard for 10 years. No one's quite sure why. But it meant that all of the engineers, by the time they came to read these and went, oh, we've got these tapes from 10 years ago, we never read them. A lot of the engineers who worked on those projects originally had died or left NASA. It took months to reconstruct the data format that they used. And it involved looking at the physical machinery of the prototypes of the lander, for example, to figure out how they worked. So, like with Akkadian cuneiform, they had to reconstruct the language in which this data was written, even though they could physically read the ones and zeros off the magnetic tape, just like us visually looking at a clay tablet. We have access to all this information, but we don't know what it means. And fortunately, both in this case and in the case of Ernest's clay tablets, we have been able to reconstruct the language used here. But it's non-trivial, it took effort, and it's something that we have to be aware of when we store data in very data-dense encodings, is that those encodings then need to be preserved as well. Next up, we have more spinning disks. Here is a hard drive disk. We all know them, love them, use them. You get them built into most personal computers these days, unless you're an SSD-only enjoyer. And you can get external ones that you can fill with lots of legally acquired media. I checked the other day, and it looks like 20 terabytes is available now, but it's sort of, you don't go much higher than that commercially. Wikipedia says like 26 terabyte data drives were available last year, but I couldn't find them. Same paradigm as floppy disks, vinyls, and CDs. This thing spins around, head reads off it. This is magnetic material, and don't put your electromagnets near your hard drives. This was IBM again, who pioneered these, with the first coming out in 1957, and had a whopping 3.75 megabits of God's own information, megabytes of God's own information. In the photo above, you can see two of them, these cabinets, these big cabinets. They are each one hard drive. They had 52 disks each, and one arm holding two read-write heads. They kept iterating, improving the hardware. They briefly flirted with a model that had one read-write head per track on the disk. Once again, too expensive to justify the performance increase, and they just discontinued them. And over the 1890s, these went from being a novelty and very, very cool to being standard issue on PCs. This is an up-close photo of one. Again, magnetic field camera here. I think it's a magnetic field camera. Actually, no, it's not. It's going to be a microscope, isn't it? Look how small that is. These have got to the stage, this is a modern hard drive close-up photo, these have got to the stage where the areas of the disks being magnetized are so microscopic that they risk losing their magnetic state due to a phenomenon known as superparamagnetism, which is where heat can cause magnetized material to flip its polarity in areas smaller than 50 nanometers. And here we're looking at 200 micrometers. The thickness of a piece of copy paper is about 70,000 to 880,000 nanometers thick. So we're talking about areas smaller than 50 nanometers are vulnerable to this kind of superparamagnetism quantum effect. We made magnets so small the universe just doesn't like it. We're like bumping up against the physical constraints of the universe where it's like you can't have magnetized areas that small, they just get randomly flipped. And in order to counteract this, what we do is we have two layers of magnetized material as part of a hard disk with a thin layer, like 3 atoms thick, of like ruthenium, which is not magnetic. And these two plates are magnetized oppositely so that they reinforce, they attract and reinforce each other across this 3-atom boundary of ruthenium. And this is strong enough reinforcing effect to counter the superparamagnetism. But that's so cool. It's like we can't make the disks any more data dense without making them, well, you can't make them all the way data dense. If we want them to be bigger, they have to be physically bigger because we're bumping up against the limits of what we can store as a physical object, data as a physical object on this medium. The universe just says no. It's incredible. So that's hard drives. And last but not least, flash memory. You've got some of this in your pocket. It's in smartphones, tablets. If you've got a YubiKey 2FA token, it's running off flash. And they work by using a circuit component called a MOSFET, which is a floating gate MOSFET, which is extremely complicated, but it's basically a bucket that can store electrical charge. And generally, it has charge or it doesn't, ones and zeros, but there are techniques for optimizing memory that use fractional filling of MOSFETs, I believe. The drive will draw power from whatever computer it's connected to, or at least these ones will. So again, removable media, just plug it in, and plug and go. And they do have a few limitations and drawbacks, which are being mitigated as the technology is developed, because this is still under active development. For a given block of storage, you can only really write to it all at once, not in patches. They also have a lifetime limit on how many times those buckets can be emptied and refilled. They get worn out, they get holes in them, charge starts leaking. To mitigate this, most flash drives include something called a memory controller, which cleverly manages the write process to spread wear and tear physically across the device equally. This process is called wear leveling. And even if they are new MOSFETs, they will leak charge over time, just because, entropy, I guess. And if you have a USB, put some data on it, and then leave it in a drawer for 10 years like NASA did with the magnetic tapes, you might not be able to get ungarbled data back out of it. My wedding photos from my wedding to my spouse, the USB had this happened to the USB, and we had to go back to the photographer and be like, "Hi, can we have our photos again, please?" Fortunately, it was like within a year, so she still had them. But these are, despite being incredibly complicated and high-tech engineering, there are physical effects that can still cause this data to be lost that's stored in this way. So what you should be doing is sort of regularly backing up this stuff. Physically, these are not actually as durable as a lot of people think. Kind of scary. Right, future stuff. Oh, and SSDs are flash memory. SSDs are like beefier, bigger, beefier flash drives, to my understanding, which is, again, why this is still under development. There are still new innovations being made because SSDs are huge now, right? So, we have got 50 minutes to go. Fabulous. We've learned all about the history, current state of data storage. We know a bit about how and why the various types are used for various purposes. I forgot to talk about, back in the hard drive stuff, the reason that I started writing this talk. Data storage company, or crowd company, based out of Paris. They have an underground bunker in Paris where they've got their long-term data storage, their cold data storage, and they don't actually use magnetic tapes like a lot of other cloud providers. They use a specific kind of encoding, a specific kind of writing to hard disks called shingled magnetic recording, which is it has properties that make it really good for long-term data storage, better data density, but it's a lot more complicated to write to random bits of it. But for cold data storage, you don't typically need to. I don't know if the secret data bunker underneath Paris is anywhere near the catacombs, but maybe if you put your long-term data storage into Scaleway's iceberg storage or whatever it's called, it'll get ghosts. I don't know, but I know how it's stored, and it's on cool hard drive encodings. Sorry, I forgot I took this out of this talk, but I promised it earlier. We've learned all about the history of all of these things. We've got these current methods of storage. They're going to continue to get incrementally better over time. We'll make bigger hard drives. We'll make better SSDs, all of this stuff. That stuff's not cool and sexy and paradigm changing. A lot of the stuff that is very speculative, but some of it is actually somewhat real and being used. And that's the kind of stuff that I want to talk about in this last section. So first up, we have DNA data storage. When I was first learning about this, I assumed it meant you put your data into a bean, and then the plant grows, and then it propagates the data, and all of its descendants also have that data in it. That's not how it works. What this is using DNA, the physical structure, of the kind of molecules that we have in our bodies, to store data. Synthetic DNA that would not produce a living organism, but the base pairs, like the C, Gs, As, and Ts, turns out DNA as a physical chemical structure is incredibly durable. It's incredibly long-term storage of it at low temperatures is incredibly successful. You can store it for ages. And if we could just develop an encoding to reliably turn, let's say, binary data into these base pairs, we could use this as a method for long-term data storage. Partly, I think it's cool sci-fi. Partly, I think it's probably there's got some synergy with other kinds of research that have more immediate impacts. But yeah, this is an ongoing thing, and I think one of the areas of research at the moment is what are the best encodings we can use to turn, how can we most data densely or most with a best error recovery or whatever, what are the different algorithms for translating between these two different representations of data. There is DNA data on the moon, courtesy of the Bereshit lander in April 2019. It did crash, so maybe that data might be lost, but if it isn't, then the Arch Mission Foundation, who did this launch, built and sent the lander, they estimate it could still be legible in billions of years, because it's cold in space and DNA is very stable at low temperatures. Billions of years. That's wild. I love the idea that aliens will find this DNA and be like, what kind of animals were going on here? And it's not, it's just I don't know, the doom, I guess. That's what we put in everything, isn't it? thinking about long-term data storage, this is something that people are starting to think about when, like, long-term futurists. I talked earlier about the digital dark age as a concept, and this is the idea that so much of what we write down now is in formats that would not be legible if we lost the technology we currently have that enable us to read and write to them, like QR codes. If a big old electromagnetic wave, like, pulse from the sun, whatever it is, the thing that's in loads of sci-fi novels, if that hit us now, what would our information culture look like? And there were lots of people who are very worried about this and are trying to come up with ways that we can write down things that are important to us as a species, as a culture, and obviously many, many cultures across the world. A lot of the research that I'm talking about has been conducted in the West, just because that's what my sources are. But tangent. People want to write things down so that we might be able to read them in the future in ways that are not vulnerable to, something like an electromagnetic pulse, or, ways that are going to be durable even if we don't know what our future is going to look like. And this next stuff is 5D optical data storage, which is a marketing term. It is not really 5 dimensions. Obviously, it's a 3D object, but the extra 2 dimensions are supposed to represent how close to it you are and what angle you're looking at it from, which, yeah. But what it actually is you take some sort of clear, very tough, durable substrate, non-photosensitive, like a bit of fused quartz or glass, and you use a laser to engrave data within it. Points in the 3D matrix, represent that's physical locations representing like abstract locations. The photo above is, or the photo in this slide is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights engraved into a piece of glass and looking like the UN logo. Very cool, very cute. And the idea is that if we know how to read from this stuff, this is actually incredibly resilient to all kinds of natural forms of decay. It's not affected by magnetism. If your glass is not photosensitive, then it's not really going to be affected by other electromagnetic radiation or visible spectrum light and things like that. It's unless you drop it, it's pretty durable. And Hitachi and Microsoft have both worked on this concept. The current bleeding edge stuff is at Southampton University in the UK. And this data isn't going to go anywhere unless you drop it. But how are we encoding it? If you gave me this piece of glass, I would not know how to get the Universal Declaration of Human Rights out of it. That's the problem that they're really trying to solve. We've got the physical technology to make stuff last functionally forever, as long as we can have reasonable expectations someone's going to look after it. But what we can't do necessarily is design, or we have not yet managed to design methods of encoding that will definitely be able to be legible to people in the future. And this leads on to more philosophical questions about, the nature of understanding, the nature of communication. How can we can deal with these communications today with each other, there's communication problems today with each other in spoken English words, despite, 2 fluent speakers can misunderstand each other. You magnify these problems, 1,000-fold when you start thinking about, well, there's a physical translation layer to consider, so on and so forth. Please come and talk to me about all that stuff, because I'm really nerdy about it after the talk. But this is cool. It's also called Superman storage, I believe, because of they want to call it kryptonite storage because it's like crystal. So if you Google Superman storage, you'll probably find this. But 5D optical data storage, but it's lasered bits in glass, basically. Finally, just to get really weird with it in the last few minutes, let's learn about time crystals. Do we have any condensed matter physicists in the room? No. Okay. One time I did this talk and somebody raised their hand and I was like, I'm so sorry for what I'm about to do to your beautiful profession. This up here isn't a time crystal and the GIF isn't working. Oh no, hang on, the next one is a GIF. This isn't a time crystal. There are no good photos of them. This is a space crystal. And you have some in your pocket, probably, because this is silicon. And the thing that makes it a space crystal is that it has a repeating structure in space. You can move, physical translation between one bit of the crystal, and one bit of the crystal looks much like the other. It repeats across time, repeats across space, right? Time crystals are the same thing, but for time. There are no photos of an actual time crystal. This GIF kind of gets the philosophical idea across. My goodness. A time crystal is an object whose lowest energy state, its resting state, is one of motion rather than of stillness. This doesn't break the conservation of energy because something quantum physics. They were first theorized to exist in 2012 by a theoretical physicist called Frank Wilczek, and in 2021, only 9 years later, a team of scientists at the University of Hamburg made one in a lab. It didn't look like what we'd think of as a crystal. It was a Bose-Einstein condensate, which is a state of matter you can get when you supercool boson gases. I hate when I open my freezer and I've accidentally created a Bose-Einstein condensate again. The reason they're in this talk is because some very clever people think that we might be able to use them as memory for quantum computers. This is currently an open problem. There's something called the cloning theorem in quantum computing, which states that you can't duplicate quantum state, only transfer it, meaning that any read operation from a quantum memory storage solution is intrinsically destructive. You cannot duplicate state, you can only transfer it, so it must be a destructive read operation, just like core memory back in the 50s. Time crystals, incredible Wikipedia page if you want to just like have a really weird half an hour. I think I sort of, one day when I was sleep deprived, I was reading this and I briefly understood it, and then lost it again. But they repeat in time. They've got this repeating motion, and some of them require, like some of them you can just get them into the right state and they'll start happening. Some of them require repeatedly firing a laser at them, a consistent, like, a pattern of like, just regularly firing a laser at them. They don't absorb any energy from the laser, but they do need them. That if you stop doing the laser, the thing will stop repeating its structure in time, which I think is like, it's like a nucleation site, but instead of being in space, it's in time. You need this regular laser in order for the time crystals to do its thing. Absolutely fascinating stuff. If you ever find a condensed matter physicist, ask them about time crystals, and see if they know anything. But they might be able to be memory storage for quantum computers, which is still very much an active area of research. Very, very cool stuff. But I don't think we'll get time crystals at home anytime soon, I'll be honest. So this has been a bit of a whistle-stop tour of various bits of hardware throughout the years, all the way from customer complaints in the Bronze Ages to encoding data in our DNA and becoming human information cyborgs, I guess. What I really want to get across with this is that, well, there's a few things. One is that we work in very abstract ways where we're writing code and we're working in the cloud and we're doing all these things. But somewhere in the world, some physical change is being made as a result of what we do. And this is true just as a basic fact of the technology. It's also the only reason to do any of it, right, is to affect change in the real world, in the physical world. But the physical world can then also act on our data. We are not just, we're not necessarily in control of all of our factors. The physical world is also the medium in which we write our software in a very literal way. And that matters. That can have impacts on what you're able to do technologically. And the other thing, the other sort of theme is that we're very good at writing things down. The difficult part is making sure that somebody else can read them again. Durability of encodings. And this is true in the technical sense. If I can't read off a disk anymore, it doesn't matter if the disk says what it says when it was written. If it doesn't mean anything to me, I can't use it as part of whatever system I need to use it as part of. But it's also true just when we think about day-to-day communication. Doesn't matter how good you are at writing down your stuff if nobody's ever going to read it. So make your things easy to use. Make your communications easy to understand. But this, in the technical sense as well as in the soft skill sense. All of what we do is useless unless another human can make use of it, even if that other human is us in the future. This is true just as a basic result of the physical systems that we use in order to enact our profession on the world, do software engineering, as illustrated by all the different ways that you can store data in the physical world and all the different things that can go wrong. Right, a little bit of a ramble at the end there. Thank you so much for bearing with me. That QR code, I forget where that QR code takes you, probably to an out-of-date Q&A form. The one earlier was a Rickroll, by the way, in case anyone was curious. That's been me. Thank you so much for your time and attention. We have a minute for questions, and I'll be around for the rest of the conference.